Well, tonight I'm going to have some Oklahoma chili, a chili that's been passed down quite a few ways here in Oklahoma. May have started at the Chili-Inn in Muskogee, but it continues here today on Locust Hill. And I've had this chili before, and I sort of didn't like chili because I really didn't know what it was before I had this. And the first night I had this actually was about a year ago, and I have to confess that I had about 5 bowls, and I don't recommend that you do that, but I do recommend that you taste this chili. And I'm always tempted to eat 5 bowls every time I have it, but I'm sure tonight is not going to be any exception.
Tonight we're making chili, and I call this LaRue's Chili-Inn Chili, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that here in a second. Let's go into the history of chili a little bit. This is one of my standards that I have made since I was probably 12 years old. I make it by big potfuls. I've taken it to numerous dinners. I've won 2 local chili cook-offs with this recipe. And food historians say that chili, now this is kind of a controversial thing because every region has their own story, but this is what food historians say, is the origins of chili that they can trace go back to the 1839 Texas-Cherokee Wars. Even in the 1880s, the Texas area, San Antonio had its chili queens, which is what they called the vendors in San Antonio that sold chili. Then in 1893 at the World's Fair, there was Texas chili featured, and even in 1904 at the Louisiana Purchase Expo, there was chili vendors and chili queens and chili parlors featured. And about that time is when chili parlors started appearing in Oklahoma. There was a pamphlet in 1897 that promoted settlers coming into Oklahoma, which would soon be a state. And in this pamphlet it talked about the numerous chili parlors and that it was an exotic foreign food. I guess foreign because at that time Oklahoma was Indian Territory, wasn't part of the United States. Around 1903, 1905, there was chili parlors named in city directories all over Oklahoma, Oklahoma City and Tulsa. And one of the big ones in 1910 that started was a place called Ike's Chili. And it's really famous. It's still in business. I think it was in 2004 that Martha Stewart named it as the best chili in America. In the 1960s on What's My Line, that was the answer to one of the questions that Peggy Cass answered, was what's the best chili in the world, and it was Tulsa's Ike's Chili. And even Will Rogers, the historic famed humorist who was also a Cherokee, every time he came into Tulsa for something, which was right near where he was born, he would even skip the banquets at the hotels and say he was going to Ike's for chili. And if Ike's wasn't open, he'd go knock on their door. He knew where they lived, and he'd ask for chili. He one time said in his wit quotes that are often copied and quoted all over the place, that chili is a bowl of blessedness. And another big thing happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma about chili, and that was in the 20s, where a Greek immigrant came to town and started a restaurant which then became a chain and became world famous, and it was called Coney Island. And that's where the Coney Island chili started. Today there's chili cook-offs all over Oklahoma. There's a chili cook-off season in the fall through the spring. Like I said, I've won a couple of those. A lot of the world record and world champion chili cook-off cooks are from Oklahoma. Also Texas, but Texas and Oklahoma are the big areas for chili, and they kind of have a little running feud going. And somebody once asked on a television show, what's the difference between Texas chili and Oklahoma chili? And they said the difference between J.R. Ewing and Will Rogers. So each has its own importance, and they're both good, but I'm doing Oklahoma chili because, like I said, that's what I've learned. That's where I'm from, and that's the cook-offs I've won. And my recipe comes from my great-grandma LaRue, who owned a chili parlor here in Muskogee, in the early 1900s called Chili-Inn. And then she taught her son, my grandpa, who raised me on this chili my whole life. I can remember being 2-3 years old and eating it, and he taught me. I do a few things different that he and his mother did, and I'll explain those as I make the chili. And so that's why this is called LaRue's Chili-Inn Chili. And to make this, we're going to use a little bit of shortening at the beginning. This is one of the differences between my grandpa's and my great-grandma's. They use suet, and suet's not that easy to get anymore, and it's questionable for me anyway as to the health aspect of it. I'm going to use brown beans or pinto beans, and these are some that are left over. I reserved them for this purpose from a pot of beans I made the other night for beans and cornbread. So these are fresh homemade ones made here. You can use them in the can. If you use canned beans for the proportion we're making here, you would use 2 cans. But be sure if you're using a can that you drain them and rinse them really well, because there's really gooey, sugary, syrupy stuff in the can, and you don't want that. You want to wash them and rinse them. We're going to use 2 pounds of ground beef, and I'm not using the chili ground kind, which is great big ground. I just use regular ground beef. And for this proportion, again, which is based on the 2 pounds of meat, I'm using 2 cans. And you can use fresh tomatoes if they're in season. But for now, I'm using 2 cans of diced tomatoes that have green chilies already in them. And diced is perfect for this recipe. Don't want to get sliced or anything like that. I'm going to use about a teaspoon of cumin. I'm using 1 large onion and chili powder. This is a controversial thing. I've used many different kinds. My favorite comes from a little Mexican shop in Topeka, Kansas. I don't have any of that right now, but this one that I picked is pretty good, and it smells pretty chili powderish. It doesn't smell sweet. A lot of times you'll smell them and they smell sweet, and you really can't smell the hotness, and you don't want to use those. And then I kind of spice it up with some cayenne pepper too. And so your onion, I've already started chopping it here, but you want to chop up your onion and into some pretty small little squares, but if you have some big ones too, that's okay. And then you want to reserve some of these. You don't want to cook them. You want to reserve some to put on top of the chili when you serve it, so they're fresh, crispy onions. And I already kind of did these earlier, but I'm just kind of going through and getting the bigger ones. So we're going to go over here to the stove now, and we're going to start putting the ingredients together. We're ready to start the chili on the stove. I'm using this large stainless steel pan, pot, if you want to call it that. The best thing to use is cast iron. If you have good seasoned cast iron, that is the way to go. But I gave that up a long time ago. It's really heavy. But this is pretty heavy too. So we're going to use this, and we're going to turn the fire on pretty high here. And we're going to put a big blob of shortening. If you don't want to use shortening, which some people won't want to because of health reasons, you know, you can use oil or anything, you know, a healthy kind of oil if you want to. This is the closest thing to suet, which is what the family recipe called for. And apparently was very good, and I remember it being very good when I was little. My grandpa, we went and saw him recently, and he said, you can't get the suet anymore. And so John and I asked him, well, what do you do instead? What do you use if you can't get the suet? And his answer very bluntly was, well, I just don't make it anymore. So he was real adamant about having to have the suet. Okay, so as that's melting, I'm going to get my onions that we chopped and start putting them in. This is a whole large onion. And again, we reserved some of it so that you have some fresh onion to put on top of your chili when you serve it. And you want to get this really sizzling and to where they get kind of transparent. You don't want to burn them. You don't want to brown them. You can hear them starting now. Well, my eyes are starting to water. These are getting just the way we want them. They're getting transparent. The whole room has the aroma of onions, and you can hear them sizzling. And everything's coated with the shortening, so that's a good deal. That's what we want. So now we're ready to put in the ground beef. And I do this by hand. I don't just dump the whole thing in. I do it by hand and kind of break it up like this. And when you're doing 2 pounds, you know, it takes a little bit, but it's much better this way. And this is why I don't use the chili ground beef, because, you know, you get the same effect with big pieces this way, and it's a little cheaper price-wise, not quality-wise, but price-wise. You can kind of just break it up like that. We have about 2 pounds here, give or take. I've never quite figured that out, why, you know, you have to be so specific on some recipes, because not everything you buy is that specific in its quantity, and if you find a good cut of meat, it might be 2.18, so we're just going to put it all in there regardless. Okay. And we're going to kind of stir this around. If you're using a gas stove, make sure you don't scald your wrist. You know, you have your pot moved over, because you're going to be over this for quite a while. Just kind of stir it around. And we want to totally brown this meat. We've been stirring this and browning this, and I think it's pretty much ready for the next step. It's a little bit of pinkness to it, but nothing red, and it's all mixed up with these onions. So there's your browned ground beef. Now here comes the fun part. Here comes your chili powder. I never use, let me turn this down a little bit. I never use those packets that say chili seasoning. If I did, I'd use a lot more of them than they tell you to. But I just buy either chili powder that's from one of the Mexican shops, grocers, that's in a little plasticine kind of thing, or I'll buy chili powder like this. And this is 2.5 ounces. So we're not even going to bother with this top on here. I'm not sure why it comes on there. And we're going to use about half of this bottle. That's my measurement. And I sprinkle it and cover the top. And I've actually used a little more than a half. And now I'm going to stir that around in the ground beef. And you can see the color. All the meat pretty much turns that color. The chili season or chili packets that you get for chili have all kinds of other things in it, and this recipe is very specific. We use the chili powder, and now we're going for the cayenne, and I'm going to leave the, on this one I'll leave the shaker top, but I'm just going to kind of shake it so I cover lightly the whole top of the meat. One for good measure. That's one for John. And then stir that up. Okay. So it's really simple, but this is your standard early 1900s Oklahoma chili, and that's why it wins. So we've done that, and next we want to get some moisture in there because we don't want the meat to burn. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the diced tomatoes that have green chilies in them. It's 2 cans worth, 1 can per pound of beef. Unless you're, doing fresh ones in the summer, then you'll just have to like measure it out and put it into the amount you like after you cook them. And I would cook them beforehand very lightly. They'll cook in the chili, but I would boil them, parboil them or something. Okay, so we stir that in, and now that's added some moisture. And now I'm going to add my teaspoon of cumin and sprinkle that around the top. And now we're going to add our brown beans. These are homemade ones from our beans and cornbread the other night. Oklahoma chili almost always has beans in it. That's one of the regional things. There's few people that will argue about that, but if you look at history and the chili parlors and all of the different things, pretty much always had beans in it. And at this point, this is important, you can see the juice, the broth down there, and it's the chili color. At this point, I'm going to taste it because we want to see if there's enough seasoning. We've got the chili powder, we've got the cayenne, the cumin, and then the green chilies that were in the tomatoes. I would say it needs to have just a little bit more chili powder. That's why the tasting is so important. Every chili powder that you buy is going to be a different strength. And unless you use consistently the same one, it's hard for you to know. Alright, I'll stir that in there. And as it cooks, it will get a little stronger as it cooks and the flavor starts coming out. And now we're going to add some water. Not a whole lot, about a cup. And if you like your chili thick, just do it to where it's the consistency you like it. If you like it more like soup, then add more. And there is your chili. But now comes the simmering point. If you have a cast iron pot, you might want to do it the way my grandpa says he always has done it. And I remember this because I'd wake up in the middle of the night and smell chili. And he would sometimes simmer his for, he told us, up to 20 hours. I don't remember him doing it that long when I was a kid, but I remember at least 8 or 9 hours. He would let it simmer in that pot, and he used that same cast iron pot all the time, so it was really seasoned well. I'm going to turn this down now to kind of a low, because you don't want to scald and burn the bottom. And I'm going to put the lid on it. And I'm going to let this simmer for at least an hour. And then we'll come back and see how it's doing. Well, we've let it simmer for about an hour. And, ooh, looks to me like it's ready to serve. Looks like good chili to me. So let me just turn this off and we'll get a bowl. And that's LaRue's Chili-Inn Chili. And we'll take it over here and we'll do some topping on it, a little bit of grated cheese. And some of the onions we reserved. And then I had some cornbread left. I just heated it up a while ago. This is cornbread that we made for one of the episodes on beans and cornbread, and it has actual corn in it, as in addition to the cornmeal, and jalapeno peppers. And I've warmed that up a while ago. Put it in this bag to keep it warm, and we're ready to serve. You won't be chilly anymore after eating this chili.